Hey guys! Tonight we begin with the curious, troubling, and deeply fascinating history of Victorian medicine and the substances that were supposed to heal women, but instead trapped them in a state of chemical dependence that became a defining feature of an entire era. A period where you're expected to believe that a liquid containing opium could cure your nervousness, that a powder that made your heart race might actually be good for your heart, and that the solution to a woman's emotional complexity was a small bottle that could be purchased at any respectable pharmacy for the price of a loaf of bread, or perhaps even cheaper if you knew where to look. Before you get comfortable, before we descend into this story together, I want you to do something for me. I want you to find yourself a position. Not just any position, but the one that feels like home to your body right now. The one that your body recognizes as a place where it can finally let go. Maybe it's on your back, with your head supported gently, perhaps with a pillow that has the accumulated warmth of 100 nights. Maybe it's on your side, with a pillow that knows your neck better than anyone else in your life, that has molded itself to the specific shape of how you rest. Maybe it's some other configuration entirely, something that you have discovered over years of sleeping, that your body returns to without thinking. Whatever it is, settle there. Feel the weight of your body sinking into whatever's beneath you. Feel the gravity pulling you downward, the support beneath you holding you. You're not going anywhere tonight. The world is outside. The demands of the day are outside. The noise and the commotion, and the endless requirement to be present and functional and coherent. All of that is outside. You are here in this space, and we're going to travel back together to the year 1887, to a London townhouse in a respectable neighborhood where a woman named Margaret is sitting in her parlor, and she is about to make a decision that will change everything about who she is, everything about how her body functions, everything about the relationship between her mind and her physical form. Pause. Take a slow breath in. Count to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold it. Feel your lungs expand. Feel the oxygen moving into your bloodstream. Feel your chest rise. And now, slowly let it out. Count to 4 again as you exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's right. The rhythm of breathing is what will follow tonight. In hold out, the same rhythm that Victorian women were constantly told to control, to master, to manipulate as a tool for managing their increasingly fragile nervous constitutions. Proper breathing was considered a form of medical treatment. Taking shallow breaths was thought to prevent hysteria. Breathing too deeply was considered unladylike and potentially dangerous. The story of Victorian drugs is a peculiar one. It's the story of intelligent, desperate, suffering people who were absolutely convinced they were being helped. It's the story of a medical establishment that believed it understood the female body with scientific certainty, when in fact understood very little, understood almost nothing, was working from frameworks that were fundamentally flawed but presented with absolute confidence. It's the story of pharmaceutical companies that believed they were advancing human welfare and human medicine, when in fact they were creating something far more dangerous and far more complicated and far more difficult to escape than anyone could have possibly anticipated. It's the story of an entire society that convinced itself that relief could be purchased in a bottle, that health could be measured in drops, that the human condition could be chemically corrected. It's easy to mock the Victorians from where we sit in our time, with our contemporary understanding of addiction, and our knowledge of how drugs actually affect the brain and body at a chemical level. We look back at these women, with their corsets that restricted their breathing, with their layers of clothing, with their complete dependence on substances that were literally destroying their minds and their bodies, and we feel superior. We feel grateful. We feel that sense of comfortable distance that comes from believing that we are wiser than people who came before us, that we would never make the mistakes they made, that we have somehow transcended the problems that plagued them. But here's what makes this story genuinely curious and disturbing in equal measure, what makes it deserve our attention and our contemplation even as we drift towards sleep. The Victorians were not stupid. The doctors were not incompetent in any fundamental way. The pharmaceutical companies were not intentionally malicious in their desires to harm people. They were all operating within a framework that made complete sense given what they knew and what they didn't know about how the world actually works. They were working within a paradigm, and in their sincere attempt to help, in their genuine belief that they were reducing suffering and advancing human welfare, they ended up creating a different kind of suffering altogether, one that was quieter, more insidious, far more difficult to recognize, and infinitely more difficult to escape from than the original problem. Pause. This is a story of opium in all its forms. This is a story of laudanum, that beautiful, mysterious liquid that promised relief from nervousness and delivered something far more complex, far more subtle, far more impossible to escape from. Laudanum was opium dissolved in alcohol and had been used in Europe for centuries, but it was in the Victorian era that it became ubiquitous, that it became woven into the fabric of daily life, that it became the primary tool for managing any kind of emotional or physical discomfort. This is also the story of cocaine, which was not viewed as a dangerous drug, but as a miracle medicine, a cure for depression and fatigue, and the general malaise of modern life. Cocaine was new. Cocaine was modern. Cocaine was scientific. Cocaine was what enlightened people took when they wanted to feel better. And because it was new, because it was scientific, because it seemed modern and progressive, people believed in it. They believed in it even more than they believed in traditional medicines. This is a story of how these substances move from being medical necessities to being social fashion to being desperate addiction, all while remaining entirely legal and entirely respectable, all while remaining endorsed by doctors and society, and the very institutions that should have been protecting people from exactly this kind of harm. And it is most importantly the story of women, because while both men and women use these substances, it was women who bore a particular burden, a particular vulnerability. Women were told that their emotions were pathological. Women were told that their nervousness was a sign of weakness in their physical constitution. Women were told that their inability to remain calm and composed at all times was indicative of disease. Women were told that their salvation could be found in a bottle, could be administered through a dropper, could be measured in increments of 5 or 10 or 15 drops. Pause. So tonight, as you lie here warm and comfortable, far removed from the stuffy parlors and the rigid social strictures of the Victorian era, far removed from the smell of coal smoke and the sound of carriages on cobblestone streets, we're going to walk through these histories together. We're going to meet some of the women who lived through these experiences. We're going to understand why they made the choices they made, why they took the medicines, why they continued taking them even when they began to suspect something was wrong. We're going to understand the framework within which these decisions made sense. And we're going to slowly, gently drift into sleep while imagining the sound of bottles being uncorked, the taste of bitter liquids, the slow drift into a state where nothing quite matters anymore, where everything is softened, where the harsh edges of existence are gently rounded away. Before we go deeper, before we descend fully into Margaret's story, I want you to adjust your breathing once more. Breathe in slowly through your nose. You can smell, if you imagine it just right, if you allow your imagination construct the sensation, the faint sweetness of laudanum, not unpleasant, just different from the air you're breathing now. The smell of medicine, the smell of hope, the smell of a solution to a problem you didn't know how to solve, didn't understand, couldn't articulate to anyone else because the problem had no name. Breathe out slowly through your mouth. And again, in through the nose, out through the mouth. This is the breath of someone who has just taken a dose of medicine. Patient, measured, accepting, waiting for the chemical to take effect, waiting for the relief to arrive, waiting for the transformation that always comes within 20 minutes, within half an hour at most. Now, let me tell you about Margaret. Margaret was 32 years old in the year 1887. She had a husband named Charles, who was a successful merchant involved in the import-export business. He traveled frequently. He made good money. He was respected in his community. She had 3 children, 2 sons named William and James, and a daughter named Eleanor who was just beginning to become a woman herself. Her children were being raised by a nanny, because that was what one did in Margaret's social class. That was what was expected of a woman of her position. She did not raise her own children. She supervised their raising. She ensured that they were being educated properly and trained for their respective roles in society. She had a house in a respectable neighborhood. In Kensington, in London, the house was large. It had been decorated according to the fashions of the time, with heavy velvet curtains and dark wallpaper, and furniture that was more about demonstrating wealth and status than about providing comfort. She had servants. She had a cook and a maid and a gardener. She had everything that was supposed to make a woman happy, everything that her younger self had believed would constitute happiness, everything that her mother had told her to strive for. And she was miserable, not dramatically miserable, not the kind of miserable that warranted comment or concern from her husband or her friends, not the kind of miserable that would have been recognizable as mental illness or depression or any kind of medical condition, just quietly, persistently, chronically miserable in a way that she could not quite articulate to anyone. She felt tired all the time, not the tiredness that comes from physical exertion and which is relieved by rest, but a deeper tiredness that seemed to reside in her very cells, in her blood, in the fundamental structure of her being. She felt anxious. She felt as if her nerves were too close to the surface of her skin, as if the protective layer that was supposed to separate her internal experience from the external world had somehow become permeable or worn through. Everything was too much, too loud, too bright, too demanding. The sounds of the household were overwhelming. The light from the windows was harsh. The expectations of social conversation were exhausting. The responsibility of managing her children and her household and her position in society felt like a weight that was slowly crushing her, that was pressing down on her from all sides, that was making it difficult to breathe. Pause. Her husband suggested that she visit the doctor, not with concern, but with the practical understanding that if something was broken, a professional should be consulted. Her mother suggested that she take a tonic, that a restorative would help, that her nerves were simply depleted and needed replenishment. Her friend suggested, with a careful delicacy that was typical of their social class, that she simply pull herself together, that such feelings were common and would pass, that what she needed was simply more discipline, more proper behavior. They suggested that perhaps she was not getting enough fresh air, or perhaps she was reading too much, or perhaps she was spending too much time alone with her thoughts. But Margaret could not pull herself together, because she did not understand what the problem was. She only understood that something was profoundly wrong with her, that something was broken inside her, and that no amount of will or discipline or proper behavior could fix it. She tried. She tried very hard. She took cold baths in the morning. She took walks in the park. She forced herself to attend social engagements even though they exhausted her. She read improving literature. She prayed. She did everything she could think of to improve her condition, and nothing worked. So she visited the doctor. The doctor was a respectable man named Dr. Hartwell, who had been practicing medicine in London for 23 years. He had a successful practice. He was consulted by many of the respectable families in the neighborhood. He had an air of certainty and competence that inspired confidence. He examined Margaret carefully. He looked at her tongue and noted its appearance. He examined her pulse and counted the beats. He asked her questions about her digestion and her sleep and the frequency and character of her monthly courses. He asked about her childhood and her family history. He asked about her habits and her diet and her daily activities. And at the end of the examination, after he had filled several pages of his notebook with observations and notes, he determined the problem with absolute certainty. Nervous exhaustion, he said. Your nerves are depleted. Your constitution has been weakened by the demands of modern life. You are attempting to manage too many things. Your brain is overstimulated. Your nervous system is overwrought. What you require is rest, certainly, but more importantly, you require a restorative, something to calm the nervous system and allow the body to recover, something to restore the depleted reserves of your constitution. He wrote her a prescription. It was for a tonic containing laudanum. Specifically, it was a form of laudanum known as Godfrey's cordial, a preparation that had been available in England for over 130 years. It had originally been developed as a treatment for children's teething pain. It was recommended for coughs. It was recommended for diarrhea. It was recommended for nearly everything that might cause a person discomfort. And now it was being recommended for Margaret's nervousness. The prescription was for a dose of 15 drops 3 times daily, mixed in a glass of water or perhaps in a cup of tea. Margaret took it home. She took it to the chemist, who filled the prescription and gave her a dark glass bottle with precise instructions written on the label. She took the first dose in the afternoon, on the day she received it. 15 drops, measured carefully into a glass of water. The water became cloudy, slightly discolored. The taste was bitter beneath the sweetness. It coated her tongue. It moved down her throat. And she sat in her chair and waited to see if anything would happen. Pause. Within an hour, she understood what relief felt like. The anxiety that had been sitting in her chest like a stone for years, like a permanent resident that had taken up occupancy and never left, seemed to dissolve like sugar in water. The noise of the house became muted, softer, less demanding. The light from the windows seemed less harsh. Her thoughts moved more slowly, more gently, as if they were moving through a substance thicker than air, as if they were moving through water or honey or something equally thick and protective. She felt, for the first time in so many years that she could barely remember what it felt like, as if everything was going to be all right. The sense of impending doom that had been her constant companion seemed to lift. The weight on her chest seemed to ease. She could breathe properly. She could think. She could exist without the constant background hum of anxiety. She took another dose in the evening, before dinner, and the relief continued. The anxiety remained suppressed. The world remained soft and manageable. She ate dinner with her husband and did not experience the usual sense of disconnection, the usual difficulty in engaging in conversation, the usual overwhelming sense that she was performing a role rather than actually living. She slept that night better than she had slept in years. Not because she was drowsy, not because she felt sedated, but because the anxiety that had been keeping her awake was gone. Her mind was quiet. Her body was relaxed. She drifted into sleep naturally and slept deeply and woke in the morning feeling more rested than she could remember feeling. She took another dose the next morning, and another that afternoon, and the pattern was established. This is how it began, not with a moment of conscious decision, not with a moment of knowing that she was beginning something that would consume her life and alter her fundamental being, but simply with the recognition that relief was possible, that relief could be obtained through a liquid that was entirely legal, entirely respectable, entirely recommended by a medical professional, entirely endorsed by society. Pause. Margaret wakes. The room is dim. The curtains are heavy, keeping out most of the London morning, that pale gray light that characterizes English mornings for most of the year. The air smells of the previous night, her perfume, the residue of the coal fire that was allowed to die down before she retired, the particular smell of an old house that has been lived in for many years, that carries within its walls the accumulated sense of decades of habitation. She lies still for a moment, assessing her body, as she has learned to do. This is the first thing she does now. Every morning, she assesses. How is her heart rate? Is it elevated? Is the flutter present? Is the anxiety already beginning to creep up through her system? Or does she have a few hours of grace before it begins? Can she feel the nervousness gathering in the back of her mind? Or is there still peace? This particular morning, on a day in late October of 1887, 3 months after she began taking laudanum, there is a small flutter in her chest. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would be alarming to an outside observer. Just a slight irregularity in her heartbeat. A sense that something is not quite synchronized the way it is supposed to be. She can feel it when she places her hand over her heart. There is a normal beat, and then there is a slightly stronger beat, and then there is a moment where nothing happens, and then the rhythm returns. She reaches to the small table beside her bed. There is a bottle there. It is a dark glass bottle, the kind that pharmaceuticals come in. The label is printed in black ink and says, "Tonic for nervous exhaustion," in clear letters, and beneath that, written in her husband's careful hand, are the words, 15 drops 3 times daily. Charles insists on writing the dosage information, as if the act of him writing it down makes it more official, more medical, more legitimate. She does not take the dose immediately. She lies in bed for another few minutes, waiting to see if the flutter will pass on its own, waiting to see if her body will regulate itself if she simply give it time. Perhaps it is nothing. Perhaps it is simply her imagination. Perhaps the flutter will resolve without intervention. It does not pass. If anything, it becomes slightly more pronounced. She can feel it now with greater clarity. A minor irregularity that seems to echo through her entire body, that seems to be broadcasting itself through her bloodstream, that seems to be announcing to her that something is not right, that something requires attention, that something needs to be corrected. She reaches for the bottle. She takes the stopper out. The smell is distinctive. It is sweet. Immediately sweet, the sweetness of overripe fruit or flowers that have begun to decay, or perhaps the sweetness of certain candies. But there is something else beneath the sweetness. Something darker. Something that smells like nothing natural, nothing that grows in the earth, nothing that one might encounter in nature. It is a smell of chemistry, of processing, of transformation, of substances that have been extracted and concentrated and refined through industrial processes. Pause. She counts the drops carefully. This is important. Accuracy is important. She has learned this through 3 months of regular use. 15 drops exactly into a small glass of water on her nightstand. She has the water already prepared, placed there the night before. The water becomes cloudy as the laudanum mixes with it. It becomes slightly tinged with color, a pale brownish tint, almost like tea, but with that distinctive sweet smell that laudanum has. She drinks it slowly. The taste is bitter beneath the sweetness. It is not pleasant. It has never become pleasant through repetition, but she has become accustomed to it. It coats her tongue. It coats her throat. It moves down into her stomach, and she can feel it beginning to work almost immediately, or at least she believes she can feel it beginning to work. It might be her imagination. It might be the placebo effect, the power of suggestion, her expectation that the drug will work, causing her brain to perceive effects that are not actually occurring. But whether it is imagination or chemistry or some combination of both, the effect is real. The flutter in her heart begins to calm. Within a few minutes, it is gone entirely. Her heart rate is normal. Her heartbeat is steady and regular. The slight anxiety that was beginning to build in the back of her mind, the small voice that was beginning to whisper that something is wrong, has dissipated like fog in sunlight. She lies back in bed. She closes her eyes, and she feels, for a moment, completely at peace. This is the peace that she has come to expect, to anticipate, to require. This is the peace that the laudanum provides. This is the peace that allows her to face the day. She lies in this state of chemical calm for another half hour. She does not sleep. Sleep would not be appropriate at this time, but she rests. She exists in a state of suspended consciousness, where thought is minimal and feeling is muted, and nothing seems to require her immediate attention or response. Then she rises from bed. She goes to her dressing room. Her lady's maid, a woman named Sarah who has been with her for 7 years and who knows her moods and her needs with the intimacy that comes from years of close proximity, is waiting to help her into the garments that will constitute her costume for the day. The corset is fitted first. It is tightened carefully, not too tight, because too tight restricts the breathing and can cause nervousness and racing of the heart, but tight enough to create the proper shape that fashion and society demand. The corset is an instrument of transformation. Without it, Margaret's body would be one shape. With it, her body becomes a different shape entirely. Her waist becomes narrower. Her back becomes straighter. Her posture becomes more correct. The dress is a complicated affair of layers and fasteners and decorative elements. There is an underskirt. There is an overskirt. There are layers of fabric that have been trained to fall in specific ways, that have been structured through combinations of whalebone and steel and stiffening to achieve particular silhouettes. It takes nearly half an hour to dress properly for the day, and Sarah is an experienced maid, competent at her work. For a less experienced person, it might take even longer. By the time Margaret is fully dressed, when she is properly attired and her hair has been arranged and her face has been examined for any imperfections that need to be corrected with powder or rouge or other cosmetic preparations, the dose of laudanum is beginning to wear off. Not entirely. There is still a residue of calm in her system, still a lingering sense of peace, still a cushioning effect on her emotions. But there is the beginning of an edge returning. There is a beginning of an anxiety that is starting to creep back and around the margins of her consciousness. There is a beginning of a need. She goes downstairs. Her husband, Charles, is already at breakfast. He reads the newspaper. He does not look up when she enters the dining room. This is normal. This is how marriages work in Margaret's social class. They coexist in the same space without necessarily engaging with one another in any meaningful way. They fulfill their roles. They perform their functions. But they do not connect with any depth or authenticity. Pause. She sits down. She takes tea. She takes toast. She does not eat much anymore. Food seems less important than it used to be. Seems less necessary. Seems to provide less satisfaction. Or perhaps her appetite has simply changed fundamentally as a result of the drug she is taking. It is hard to tell the difference between a change that originates within herself and a change that is being imposed upon her by chemical alteration. "You look pale," Charles says, finally looking up from his newspaper. He says this as a statement of fact, not as an expression of concern. It is an observation, the kind of thing one might say about a piece of furniture or a painting, something that has been noted and is being reported. "I did not sleep well," Margaret says. This is not true. She slept well. She slept better than she has in years, actually. The laudanum ensures good sleep, ensures deep sleep, ensures sleep without dreams or disturbance. But she has learned that it is easier to lie than to explain. It is easier to give a simple, socially acceptable answer than to try to explain the complexity of her internal experience. "You should take your tonic," Charles says. "Dr. Hartwell said it would help with the pallor, with the appearance. It would restore color to your cheeks." "I already have," Margaret says. "This morning, immediately upon waking." Charles nods. He returns his attention to his newspaper. The conversation is over. There is no more need for him to be engaged. His wife has indicated that she is taking her medicine. She is managing her condition. Everything is as it should be. Margaret finishes her tea. She is beginning to feel the edge returning now, more noticeably than before. The anxiety is beginning to creep back in. It is not yet uncomfortable, not yet demanding, but she can feel it happening. She can feel it like a pressure building, like something that will eventually require release, like something that will inevitably grow more pronounced as the hours pass. She goes to her sitting room. This is her private space, the room where she spends most of her time. It is decorated in the modern style, heavy velvet curtains in deep red, dark wallpaper with a repeating pattern of flowers and vines, furniture that is more about appearance than comfort. There is a small table where she keeps her correspondence. There is a chair where she sits and reads or writes letters, though she reads less now and writes less now than she did before. There is a cabinet, a small locked cabinet, where she keeps her tonics. She has more than one now. There is the original bottle from Dr. Hartwell, which is nearly empty. There is a second bottle that she purchased herself from a chemist on the corner, without a prescription, simply by walking in and asking for it by the name she had learned from her doctor. There's a third bottle that is a different preparation. This one contains cocaine, which a friend mentioned last month, a friend named Mrs. Pemberton who had mentioned that she had discovered something even more effective than laudanum for nervous exhaustion. She opens a cabinet. She looks at the bottles. She debates which one to use for the mid-morning dose, the dose that she has gradually incorporated into her routine over the past month, as she discovered that the original 3 daily doses were becoming insufficient to manage her symptoms throughout the entire day. The cocaine is more energizing. It makes her feel alert and capable. It makes her feel, for a few hours, as if she could do anything, as if anything is possible. The laudanum is more calming. It makes everything feel softer, less demanding, less urgent. It makes her feel safe. It makes her feel as if the world is not quite real, and therefore cannot hurt her. She reaches for the laudanum. She has learned to measure the doses carefully. 15 drops is what the doctor recommended, but she has found that sometimes 20 drops is more effective, sometimes 25. She has been careful not to exceed 30 drops at any single dose, but as the weeks have passed, as her body has adapted to the chemical, as her tolerance has increased, she has gradually increased the amount that she takes at each time of day. She does not think of this as a problem. She thinks of this as learning how her body responds to the medicine. She thinks of this as being a responsible patient who understands what works best for her own particular constitution, her own particular nervous system, her own particular needs. Pause. She mixes the drops with water. She drinks the mixture. She sits in her chair. She picks up a book that she has been reading for the past 3 weeks but has made no progress in, Because it is difficult to focus on the words when the anxiety is present, when the background of her mind is constantly broadcasting a low-level signal of wrongness and tension. But now, with the dose beginning to take effect, the words are beginning to make sense. The symbols on the page are transforming into meaning. She can read for hours now, lost in the world of the story, not thinking about anything except what is happening on the page, not thinking about her real life or her real situation, or anything except the narrative that she is consuming. Time becomes strange when you are taking laudanum regularly. Hours pass that feel like minutes. Days pass without you quite remembering what happened during them. Margaret has noticed this. She has mentioned it to Dr. Hartwell in a passing way, almost as a joke, suggesting that perhaps the medicine was making her drowsy or affecting her memory. Dr. Hartwell's response was to reassure her that this was nothing to worry about. He said that a slight drowsiness was a normal side effect of the medication and that it would pass as her body adjusted to the treatment. He said that the brain fog would clear. He said that these temporary effects were simply part of the process of adjustment. It has not passed. It has been 3 months, and it has not passed. In fact, it has become more pronounced. Margaret finds herself in the afternoon without a clear memory of what she did in the morning. She finds herself unable to remember conversations that occurred just the day before. She finds herself forgetting the names of people she has known for years. She finds herself losing her place in time, uncertain about what day it is, uncertain about what time of day it is, uncertain about whether she has already taken her dose or she is still waiting for it. But Margaret has stopped thinking of this as something that might be a problem. She has stopped thinking of this as a side effect at all. She has simply incorporated it into her understanding of how the day works. She wakes. She takes her morning tonic. She drifts through the day in a state of gentle disconnection. She takes another dose at midday. She drifts through the afternoon. She takes another dose in the evening. She takes a stronger dose before bed, which ensures that she sleeps deeply and completely without dreams or disturbance or anything that might disturb her rest. This is her life now. This is the structure of her days. This is what it means to be well, according to the framework within which she is living. This is what wellness looks like when it is medicated, when it is chemical, when it is purchased in a bottle and measured in drops. Charles notices that she is different. He mentions this to her one evening as they are preparing to retire for the night. "You seem calmer," he says. "Whatever Dr. Hartwell prescribed, it appears to be working. You are not as anxious as you were. You are not as easily disturbed. You seem more settled." Margaret nods. She does not mention that she is taking significantly more than what was prescribed, that the dose has increased from 15 drops 3 times daily to 20 or 25 drops at least 4 times daily. She does not mention that she has begun to feel anxious if she does not have access to the tonic, if she does not have the bottle with her, if she is uncertain about when she will be able to take the next dose. She does not mention that she purchased another bottle from a different chemist last week, just to ensure that she would not run out, just to ensure that there would never be a moment where she needed the tonic and did not have access to it. Instead, she simply accepts the compliment. She is calmer. She is managing her nervousness. She is being a dutiful wife and mother. She is fulfilling her role. Everything is working out exactly as it should. And the laudanum continues to flow, drop by drop, dose by dose, day after day, gradually rewiring her brain, gradually changing the chemistry of her body, gradually altering her neurotransmitters, gradually moving from being a solution to a problem to being the problem itself, though she does not yet understand this distinction, though she does not yet have the vocabulary or the framework to even conceive of what is happening to her. Pause. Let me tell you about the pharmacology of Victorian medicine. Let me describe for you the substances that were being prescribed and sold and recommended during this era, because understanding this is absolutely key to understanding how Margaret and thousands like her found themselves dependent on these substances without quite understanding how it happened, without quite being able to articulate what was occurring to them, without quite believing that anything was wrong. The dominant substance was laudanum. Laudanum was a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, typically in a ratio of 1 part opium to 4 parts alcohol, though the exact proportions varied depending on who was manufacturing it and what exactly they were trying to achieve. It had been in use in Europe for centuries, since at least the 17th century, perhaps longer. It had been developed originally as a way of making opium soluble, as a way of creating a form of the drug that could be easily measured and administered in liquid form. Laudanum had been prescribed for pain. It had been prescribed for coughs. It had been prescribed for diarrhea. It had been prescribed for anxiety and melancholy and nervousness and insomnia and 1,000 other conditions. It was recommended for children. It was recommended for adults. It was recommended for elderly people. It was available without prescription at any chemist shop. You did not need a doctor's approval to purchase laudanum. You did not need to justify your need for it. You simply walked into a pharmacy and purchased a bottle, and it was yours. The beautiful thing about laudanum, from the perspective of the pharmaceutical industry, was that it worked. It genuinely did relieve pain. It genuinely did suppress coughs. It genuinely did calm nervousness. It worked so well that people kept wanting to purchase it, kept wanting to use it, kept wanting to ensure that they always had a supply available. The problem, a problem that was not yet recognized or understood by the medical establishment, a problem that was actively being denied or ignored by the pharmaceutical industry, was that it did all these things by fundamentally altering the chemistry of the brain. It was not actually treating any of these conditions. It was not healing anything. It was simply making you not care about the symptoms anymore. It was making you not notice them. It was making you not mind them. But there was another substance that was becoming increasingly popular, increasingly fashionable, increasingly understood as being modern and progressive and scientific. Cocaine. Cocaine had been isolated from coca leaves in the 1850s through a process of chemical extraction that was considered at the time to be a marvel of modern science. By the 1880s, cocaine was being marketed as a miracle drug. It could treat depression. It could provide energy. It could prevent fatigue. It could make you feel better in ways that laudanum could not, because it did not make you drowsy or disconnected from reality. Instead, it made you alert, energized, capable, brilliant. Pause. The most famous preparation was a wine called Vin Mariani. It was created by a Corsican entrepreneur named Angelo Mariani in the 1860s. Vin Mariani contained coca leaf extract mixed with Bordeaux wine. It was advertised with testimonials from famous people. Thomas Edison claimed that it helped him work. Jules Verne claimed that it enhanced his creativity. Actors claimed that it improved their performances. Pope Leo XIII allegedly endorsed it. Doctors claimed that it was beneficial for nearly every condition you could possibly name. Vin Mariani was sold internationally. It was sold in respectable establishments. It was sold as a sophisticated beverage, a product of modern science, a preparation that would enhance your capabilities and improve your health. Women drank it. Men drank it. Children drank it. It was considered sophisticated and progressive. There was also cocaine in solution, pure cocaine that could be purchased in bottles. It could be mixed into water. It could be drunk straight. It could be applied directly to the mucous membranes of the nose or mouth. It was legal. It was sold at pharmacies. It was recommended by doctors for depression, for fatigue, for a general sense of malaise or low spirits. And then there were the combinations, the patent medicines, the tonics that contained not just one active ingredient, but several. Some contained both opium and cocaine. Some contained alcohol and opium and cocaine and various other ingredients that nobody quite understood, that were included simply because they were believed to have some beneficial effect, that were included because they had been in traditional remedies and therefore must have some value. One popular preparation was called cocaine wine. It contained wine, cocaine, and various herbal extracts. Another was called Mariani's coca wine, which promised to restore vitality and energy and mental capability. Another was sarsaparilla with cocaine, which claimed to cure nearly everything: weakness, depression, poor circulation, mental fatigue, loss of memory. There was also a preparation called Coca-Cola, which was originally marketed as a medicinal tonic. It contained coca leaf extract and cola nut extract and various other ingredients. It was sold as a medicinal preparation before it became known as a soft drink. It was served at soda fountains, which were considered to be places of health and wellness, where one could go to take medicinal tonics. Pause. The marketing was sophisticated for its time. These preparations were advertised in newspapers and magazines with testimonials from doctors and patients. They were advertised as being scientifically formulated, as being a result of modern medical research, as being the kind of thing that an enlightened, progressive person would use. The advertisements often included pseudoscientific language that made the product sound credible and legitimate. They spoke of restoring depleted nervous energy, of revitalizing the constitution, of restoring the balance of the humors, using language that seemed scientific even though the actual science behind the claims was minimal to non-existent. For women specifically, there were preparations marketed toward particular ailments that were understood to afflict the female body, or rather, that were understood to afflict the female mind and nervous system. Nervousness, hysteria, female weakness, irregular or excessive menses, fainting spells, excessive emotion, emotional instability, inability to manage the stresses of modern life. All of these could be treated with the right tonic, the right preparation, the right combination of substances. There was even a class of people who made a living going from house to house, selling these preparations. They were called pharmaceutical salesmen, and they were skilled at understanding exactly what kind of preparation a particular person needed, what kind of presentation would be most persuasive, what kind of language would be most likely to convince a person to make a purchase. One such man came to Margaret's house on a day in October of 1887. His name was Mr. Davies. He was a well-dressed man of about 60, with a manner of someone who was accustomed to being listened to, who was accustomed to being welcomed into respectable homes, who carried with him an air of authority and legitimacy. He came to the front door with his sample case, and he asked if he might have a word with the lady of the house. Sarah, the maid, should have turned him away. She had been trained to turn away door-to-door salesmen. But Mr. Davies had a manner that made refusal difficult. He was not pushy. He was not rude. He was not aggressive. He was simply so confident in his right to be there, so certain of his legitimacy, that he seemed like an entirely natural part of the household, that he seemed like someone who had every right to be inside the house asking to speak to Margaret. Margaret received him in her sitting room. He was careful not to intrude, not to make assumptions about her time, but he was also clear that he had something valuable to show her, something that would be of genuine benefit to her. He opened his case and began to remove bottles. One by one, he displayed them, describing in detail what each one did, who had recommended it, what specific ailments it treated, what testimonials he had received from satisfied customers. "I can see that you are a woman of sensibility," he said, examining Margaret's face carefully with the eye of someone who had done this many times before, who could read in a woman's face the signs of nervousness, the signs of exhaustion, the signs of emotional fragility. A woman who understands the importance of maintaining one's constitution. A woman who takes seriously the management of her health. "I have something I think might be particularly beneficial for you." He removed a bottle. It was labeled Dr. Hammond's cocaine elixir. It contained cocaine, alcohol, and various herbal extracts. It was colored a deep amber. He described how it could provide energy, improve mood, enhance mental clarity, allow a woman to accomplish more with her day, allow her to feel more present and capable. Pause. "But surely," Margaret said, "laudanum is sufficient? I have been taking it for 3 months now, and I feel it's been very helpful." "Laudanum is excellent for calming the nerves," Mr. Davies agreed, nodding thoughtfully. "Excellent for relaxation. Excellent for evenings. Excellent for times when you need to rest and recover. But it does not provide the kind of invigoration that a woman of your apparent activity level requires. You see, laudanum is for relaxation, for evenings, for times when you need to rest. But during the day, when you need to manage a household, when you need to be present for your family, when you need to be attentive and capable and brilliant, you need something different. You need invigoration. You need energy. You need to feel capable and alive and brilliant." He demonstrated the product carefully. He showed her the testimonials written on small cards, testimonials from doctors who had recommended it, from women who had used it and reported that it had changed their lives, that it had allowed them to accomplish more, to feel more capable, to manage their lives with greater ease. He explained how many women of her social standing were now using it, how it was becoming the fashionable preparation among enlightened women who understood the importance of using modern medicine to enhance their capabilities. He suggested that she might want to try it, just for a week, just to see how it made her feel. He assured her that there was no commitment, no obligation, that she could simply try it and see if it was beneficial. Margaret was not particularly susceptible to sales pitches, but the description was appealing. She had been feeling rather listless in the afternoons, had been struggling to maintain her energy through the day, had been finding it difficult to manage all of her responsibilities with the focus and capability that she believed she should be able to maintain. And the idea of feeling more capable, more present, more energized was attractive. She had not realized how much she wanted to feel that way until Mr. Davies described it to her. She purchased a bottle. Mr. Davies also sold her a combination preparation, laudanum for the evenings and the cocaine preparation for the afternoons. He explained how they worked together, how the cocaine would keep her energized during the day and the laudanum would allow her to rest properly at night. He presented it as a comprehensive system, a scientific approach to maintaining optimal health throughout the entire day. He also mentioned, almost in passing, dropping the information casually as if it was almost an afterthought, that he was available to make house calls. If she ever needed supplies, if she ever wanted to consult about the best preparations for her particular constitution, she could simply send a message and he would be delighted to call on her. He left his card on her side table, and he left her sitting room with the confidence of someone who had just made a significant sale, who had just added another customer to his expanding network. Margaret paid him and he left, but she had his card, and she knew, for the first time, that the access to these substances was no longer dependent on a doctor or on the chemist who might judge her. She could simply order them, and they would arrive at her door. She could simply ask Mr. Davies to call, and he would bring her whatever she wanted. This is how it expanded. This is how what began as a medical prescription evolved into a self-directed pharmaceutical regimen. This is how Margaret, who had begun taking laudanum under the supervision of a doctor, gradually moved into a situation where she was managing her own drug use, making decisions about doses and combinations and timing based entirely on how she felt and what effect she wanted to achieve. Pause. By the middle of 1888, 6 months into her regular use of laudanum, and 3 months into her use of the cocaine preparations, Margaret was barely recognizable to the people who had known her before she began taking the medications. Not in appearance, necessarily, though that had changed too. She still dressed properly. She still maintained her house. She still fulfilled the social obligations required of her station. She still appeared to the outside world to be a respectable woman managing a respectable household in a respectable way. But something fundamental had changed. Something deep within her had shifted. Her personality had altered in ways that were subtle but profound. She had become more energetic in some ways. She could sustain focus on particular tasks for extended periods, could work on her correspondence or her needlework for hours without tiring. But she had become more withdrawn in other ways. She had lost interest in many of the things that had previously engaged her, had become less interested in social interaction, had begun to prefer the solitude of her sitting room to the engagement of social engagements. She was capable of intense focus on things that interested her, but she was also easily distracted. She would begin a project with great enthusiasm and then abandon it days later, without explanation or completion. She had difficulty remembering conversations that had occurred just days before. She would forget that people had visited her. She would forget social obligations that she had accepted. She became irritable if she did not have access to her medications. If she realized at any point during the day that she had forgotten to bring her bottles with her, or she anticipated that she might not have access to them for a particular period of time, she would become anxious and tense. She would snap at her servants over minor issues. She would become short with her husband. Pause. She had developed a tremor in her hands that was sometimes barely noticeable and sometimes quite pronounced. On some days, she could hold a teacup without the liquid sloshing around. On other days, the cup rattled in its saucer, and she had to put it down to avoid spilling. She found it embarrassing. She tried to hide it. She would keep her hands occupied so that no one would notice. Her physical health had begun to deteriorate. She had noticed this gradually, at first not quite wanting to acknowledge it, but eventually becoming impossible to ignore. She had lost weight. She was not dieting. She was still eating roughly the same amount that she had always eaten, but her body seemed to be consuming itself from within. Her clothes, which had fit her properly just a month before, now hung loose on her frame. She could see her ribs when she undressed. Her face had become thinner, more angular, less like the face she recognized from her mirrors. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that no amount of powder could quite cover, no amount of rouge could quite compensate for. Her eyes had developed a hollow quality, as if something essential had been scooped out of them and replaced with something else. Something darker, something more desperate, something that did not quite look like her own eyes anymore. Her teeth were beginning to show signs of decay. This was not uncommon among people who use laudanum and cocaine regularly. The combination of the drugs themselves and the constant state of acidic nausea that they could cause, the fact that she was consuming them in sugar water, the fact that her body was not processing nutrients properly, all of these things led to dental problems that were becoming increasingly obvious to her and to everyone around her. She made an appointment with a dentist, hoping that he might be able to repair the damage or at least explain what was happening. The dentist, a man named Mr. Preston, examined her carefully. When he had finished, he told her quite directly that her teeth were deteriorating rapidly and that something she was consuming, some substance that she was ingesting, was causing the damage. He suggested that she stop using whatever it was that was causing the problem. But of course, she could not stop. She could not imagine stopping. The thought of stopping was terrifying. Her memory had become quite poor. She would forget conversations that had occurred just hours before. She would forget appointments. She would start to do something and forget why she had started it in the middle of the action. She would be in conversation with someone and lose her thread of thought halfway through a sentence. She would find herself unable to recall what she had done that morning or what she had done the previous day. Eleanor, her daughter, who was now 17 years old and beginning to become a woman, noticed that her mother was no longer quite present in her own life. She would sit in the room while things happened around her, but she seemed disconnected from them, as if she was watching events from a great distance, as if there was a glass wall between her and the rest of the world, as if she was observing her own life rather than living it. Eleanor loved her mother, but Eleanor was also beginning to understand that something was profoundly wrong, that something was happening to her mother that went beyond normal nervousness or normal health issues. Eleanor was beginning to notice the bottles. Eleanor was beginning to notice the patterns of her mother's behavior, the way her mother seemed to need to take something at regular intervals throughout the day, the way her mother became anxious and tense if the time for the next dose approached, and she did not have access to the preparation. Eleanor tried again to convince her mother to stop taking the medications. She brought her an article that she had found in a journal, an article that discussed the dangers of habituation to certain pharmaceutical preparations. She begged her to try the withdrawal process again, but more slowly this time, more carefully. She suggested that they could do it together, that she would help, that it was possible to recover, that her mother did not have to be trapped by these substances forever. Pause. Margaret listened. She heard what her daughter was saying, but she was beyond the point where such arguments could reach her. She had become dependent not just physically, but psychologically. The medications had become the center of her world. Everything else was secondary to the question of whether she had access to them, whether she would be able to take her next dose at the appropriate time, whether she would have to experience the terrible discomfort that came when she did not have access to them. "You do not understand," Margaret told her daughter, with a voice that was tired and resigned and defensive all at once. "You think this is something I can simply stop if I want it badly enough. You think it is a matter of will, of discipline, of trying hard enough. But it is not like that. My body requires these medications. Without them, I cannot function. The doctors have told me this. This is medical science. This is how my constitution works. Dr. Hartwell himself told me that some people simply require medication to function properly, and that I appear to be one of those people." She did not say the thing that was true, but that she could not quite admit even to herself, that she was terrified of the withdrawal, terrified of facing whatever it was that the medications had been covering up all this time, terrified of discovering who she was without them, what her life would be like without them, whether she would even be capable of existing without them. Her social life had largely disappeared, though she did not quite notice it disappearing. It simply faded away gradually. One invitation declined after another, one friendship allowed to lapse after another. She could no longer maintain the energy required for social engagement. She could no longer keep up with the conversations and the performative aspects of social interaction. She declined invitations. She was too tired. She was too weak. She was too unwell. Her friends gradually stopped calling. The networks of connection that had defined her social existence simply faded away, one by one, until she was largely isolated, connected to the world only through her servants and her family and Mr. Davies, who called regularly to ensure that she was well supplied with her preparations. She spent most of her time in her sitting room. She sat in her chair. She took her medications at regular intervals throughout the day. She did not read anymore because she could not concentrate, could not follow a narrative, could not maintain focus long enough to extract meaning from the symbols on the page. She did not write letters anymore because she could not organize her thoughts, could not translate her internal experience into coherent language, could not maintain enough mental clarity to compose something worth sending to another person. She simply sat. She existed. She took the medications. She waited for the day to pass and the night to come. She waited for the next dose. She waited for relief. She waited for the anxiety to rise and then for the medication to suppress it again. Charles was deeply concerned. He consulted with numerous doctors, seeking to understand what was happening to his wife, seeking to find a solution, seeking to return her to the state of health and functionality that she had briefly achieved when she first began taking the medications. Some of the doctors he consulted suggested that she might be depressed, that she might have a constitutional weakness, that her condition might not be reversible. Some suggested that she had developed a disease of the mind, hysteria, or what was beginning to be called neurasthenia, or what would eventually be understood as depression. None of them connected the deterioration to the medications she was taking. This was not because they were stupid. It was because the idea that medications prescribed by respectable doctors could be harmful was simply not part of the medical framework of the time. Medications were by definition helpful. If a patient was becoming worse while taking medications, the problem must be with the patient, not with the medications. The patient's constitution must be weaker than expected. The patient's condition must be more serious than originally understood. The patient must require stronger medications, not fewer. So Charles brought her to more doctors, and each doctor examined her and prescribed more medications. Each new medication added another layer to the chemical alteration of her brain and body, another substance interacting with all the other substances, creating combinations and effects that nobody could predict or control or fully understand. Pause. Eleanor removed one of her mother's bottles without permission and without her mother's knowledge. She felt guilty about doing this. It felt like a violation. But she felt that she needed to understand exactly what her mother was consuming, needed to know precisely what the medications contained, needed to have specific information that she could use to convince her mother that something was very wrong. She brought the bottle to her uncle, who was a surgeon at one of the teaching hospitals in London. She asked him to examine it carefully, to tell her what it contained, to explain to her what her mother was actually ingesting every day, several times a day. Her uncle examined the bottle carefully. He read the label. He smelled the contents, bringing the bottle to his nose and breathing in the distinctive sweet smell of laudanum. And his face changed. His expression transformed from casual curiosity to something much more grave. He looked at his niece with deep concern. "Where did your mother get this?" he asked. "From her doctor," Eleanor said. "From Dr. Hartwell. He prescribed it for her nervousness. She takes it every day. She takes it many times a day. I think she is taking more than what was prescribed." Her uncle was quiet for a long time. He set the bottle down on his desk. He looked at it as if it was something dangerous, something that should be handled carefully, something that required consideration before he said anything about it. Then he said, "Eleanor, I need you to listen to me carefully. What your mother is taking is not medicine in the way that most medicines are medicine. What she is taking is a poison, though that is not what it is called. It is called medication, and it has been prescribed by a doctor, which makes it seem legitimate, which makes it seem safe, which makes it seem like something that she should be taking. But what is actually happening to your mother is that she is being poisoned slowly by a substance that she cannot control and that her body has become dependent upon." He explained to her, in terms that were both clear and deeply frightening, what laudanum was, what it did to the brain, what dependence meant, how the body adapted to the substance and required more and more of it to achieve the same effects, how the symptoms that were being treated, the nervousness, the anxiety, were actually being caused by the medication itself, how the original condition that Margaret had come to the doctor complaining about was likely much less serious than the condition that the medication had created. Eleanor was horrified. She was frightened. She was also angry. Angry at the doctor, angry at her mother for taking the medications, angry at a medical system that had allowed this to happen. She went to her mother and showed her the explanation that her uncle had provided. She begged her to stop taking the medications. She begged her to visit a different doctor, someone who might understand what was happening, someone who might be able to help her. Margaret's response was unexpected. She became angry. She told Eleanor that she did not understand. She told her that the medications had saved her life. She told her that without them, she would be unable to function. She told her that her uncle did not understand modern medicine, that he was stuck in old-fashioned thinking, that he was not qualified to comment on what her doctor had prescribed. Pause. But beneath the anger, there was fear. There was a beginning of understanding that something was profoundly wrong. There was a recognition that what had begun as a solution had become a trap. There was a knowledge that she could not stop taking the medications, but also the growing awareness that continuing to take them was destroying her. She made an appointment with a different doctor. This doctor was a younger man, recently trained, influenced by newer thinking about pharmacology and the dangers of overmedication. His name was Dr. Edward Chamberlain. He had begun to notice patterns in his patients, had begun to recognize that certain medications seemed to be creating more problems than they were solving, had begun to develop theories about dependence and addiction that were not yet widely accepted in the medical community. He listened to Margaret describe her symptoms. He examined her, and then he told her something that no other doctor had told her. "You are addicted," he said simply, with a directness that was shocking. "What you are experiencing is not nervousness. It is not a constitutional weakness. It is dependence. Your body has become dependent on these substances. The anxiety you feel when you do not take them, the tremor, the difficulty with memory, the inability to function, these are all symptoms of dependence, not symptoms of condition that you were originally trying to treat." Margaret's first response was denial. She told him that he was wrong. She told him that she was taking the medications as prescribed, or at least as recommended by her doctor. She told him that she was not addicted because addiction was something that happened to other people, to people who were weak or immoral or lacking in self-control. Addiction was something that happened to people of lower social classes, people without education, people without the discipline and will to manage their own behaviors. But the doctor was patient. He explained to her that dependence was not a moral failure. It was a physical phenomenon. It was a change in the brain and body caused by prolonged exposure to certain substances. It could happen to anyone, regardless of their moral character or their self-control or their social status. He explained that stopping the medications suddenly would be dangerous, that her body had adapted to the presence of these substances, and withdrawal could cause serious symptoms, that the process of stopping would need to be gradual and careful, with medical supervision. He offered to help her. He offered to help her gradually reduce the medications over a period of weeks or months while managing the withdrawal symptoms. He offered to help her return to a state of being herself again, whatever that might look like, whatever that might mean. Margaret accepted his offer. She was not sure why she accepted. She was not sure if it was courage or desperation or simply exhaustion at the thought of continuing as she was. But she accepted, and that decision marked the beginning of one of the most difficult experiences of her life. The first phase was reduction of the cocaine preparation. Dr. Chamberlain recommended reducing it by a tiny amount every few days. This seems insignificant. One drop. What is one drop out of 20? What is one drop out of 30? It should be meaningless. It should be unnoticeable. But it was not unnoticeable. Within a day of reducing the dose, Marta began to experience symptoms. The anxiety returned, but it was a different kind of anxiety than what she had originally experienced. This anxiety was physical. It lived in her chest and her throat. It made her heart race at unpredictable moments. It made her feel as if she was suffocating even when she was breathing normally. She also began to experience other symptoms. Her skin became hypersensitive. Textures that had never bothered her before became unbearable. The feel of her stockings against her legs was painful. The touch of fabric against her arms made her want to scream. Every nerve ending in her body felt as if it was overactive, as if it was transmitting signals that were 10 times too strong, as if it was broadcasting pain where there should be none. Sleep became impossible. Before, the laudanum had ensured that she slept deeply and completely. Now, without it, or with less of it, she could not sleep at all. She would lie in bed for hours, her mind racing, her body rigid with tension, waiting for the moment when she might drift off. But that moment never came. Hours would pass. The entire night would pass, and she would emerge from her bedroom in the morning having not slept at all. By the end of the first week of withdrawal, Margaret had not slept for more than 4 hours total. She was exhausted in a way that she could not have imagined. She was exhausted not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. She found it difficult to concentrate on anything. She found it difficult to remember simple things. She found it difficult to engage in conversation without losing her thread of thought halfway through a sentence. She went back to Dr. Chamberlain. She told him that she could not do this. She told him that the withdrawal was worse than the original condition, worse than the dependence, worse than anything she had experienced before. She told him that she wanted to go back to her medications, that she wanted to resume taking them, that she could not bear to continue with the withdrawal process. The doctor listened. He was sympathetic, but he told her that this was temporary. This was withdrawal. It would pass. If she went back to medications, she would be right back where she started, trapped, dependent, with no way out. The only way through was forward. He prescribed something to help with the withdrawal symptoms. He prescribed a sleeping draft. He prescribed something for the anxiety. He prescribed various other medications meant to ease the transition. But none of these medications were the substances she was dependent upon. And so the withdrawal continued. Pause. Recovery was not simply the absence of withdrawal symptoms. Recovery required rebuilding. It required relearning how to manage her emotions without medication. It required relearning how to experience the full range of her emotional life, including the emotions that the medications had been suppressing. The sadness, the fear, the anger, the disappointment, the grief. This process took much longer than the withdrawal itself. The acute withdrawal symptoms began to resolve after about 2 months. She was sleeping better. Her anxiety was decreasing. Her mind was becoming clearer. She was beginning to remember what it felt like to exist without constantly thinking about the next dose of medication. But deeper recovery took years, and it was not linear. There were setbacks. There were days when the anxiety returned suddenly, and she thought she might need to go back to medications, thought that perhaps recovery was impossible, thought that she might be broken forever. There were nights when she could not sleep, and she remembered how the laudanum had allowed her to escape the sleeplessness, remembered how reliable it had been, remembered how effective. There were moments of despair where she wondered if she would ever feel normal again, if she would ever be able to experience joy or contentment or anything other than this constant struggle to exist without the chemical support that she had become addicted to. There were days when the physical symptoms returned, the tremor in her hands, the palpitations in her heart, and she wondered if the medications had damaged her permanently, if her body would ever fully recover. But gradually, over months and then years, a new normal began to emerge. Not the normal she had experienced before she began taking the medications. That person was gone forever, and she could not return to being her, could not undo the changes that had occurred, could not go back in time and choose differently. But a different kind of normal, a normal that included her history of dependence, her experience of withdrawal, her understanding of how fragile the human brain is, how vulnerable all of us are to the promises of easy solutions, how easily the thing that is supposed to help us can become the thing that destroys us. She developed relationships with Eleanor and with her other children based on honesty and authenticity, in a way that she had not been capable of doing while she was dependent on medications. She rebuilt her friendships, though some of the old friendships never quite recovered. She took up reading again, Though her reading was different now, she was drawn to books about science, about medicine, about the human brain, about chemistry. She wanted to understand what had happened to her. She wanted to know how the substances worked. She wanted to be able to articulate her experience to others. She advocated, quietly, for women who were still dependent on medications. She did not do this publicly. Such a thing would have been scandalous, would have destroyed her social reputation, would have marked her as damaged and broken. But she supported other women who came to her, who had heard that she had been through this process, who wanted to know if recovery was possible. She told them that yes, it was possible. It was difficult. It was painful, but it was possible. She became, in her own small way, a resource for women struggling with the same problem that she had struggled with, though always quietly, always carefully, always within the bounds of propriety. She wrote letters to Dr. Chamberlain, thanking him for his help, praising his work, encouraging him to publish his protocol, to share his methods with other doctors, to help bring about change in how medications were prescribed and how dependence was understood. She believed that if his work became known, if his methods were adopted more widely, many women could be saved from the fate that she had nearly suffered. Dr. Chamberlain did eventually publish his work. His protocols were described in medical journals. His case studies were analyzed. But the response from the medical establishment was not what he or Margaret had hoped for. The medical establishment was not ready to acknowledge that it had created a problem. The pharmaceutical industry was not ready to accept restrictions on their products. Most doctors continue to prescribe laudanum and cocaine and various other medications without carefully monitoring for dependence or withdrawal. The crisis continued through the 1890s and into the 20th century. Thousands of women continue to become dependent on medications. Thousands of women continue to struggle with withdrawal and recovery. It would not be until the early 20th century, decades later, that real regulations began to be implemented. It would not be until after the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 that cocaine and opium-based medications would begin to be restricted. It would not be until the 20th century that doctors would begin to truly understand dependence and develop protocols for managing it. It would not be until the late 20th century that the full extent of the Victorian drug crisis would be recognized and understood and acknowledged as one of the great public health disasters of the Victorian era. But in the 1890s, in the time when Margaret was recovering, change was still far away. The crisis continued. Thousands of women continued to suffer. Thousands of women continue to die from the effects of these substances while still taking them. Their health so compromised by years of drug use that their bodies simply could no longer function, their organs failing, their minds deteriorating, their will to live eroding away. And Margaret lived out the rest of her life in a state of cautious recovery. She was well for periods of time. She relapsed occasionally. There were days when anxiety became overwhelming and she thought about returning to medications. And sometimes she did take them again for a day or two before stopping. But overall, she remained off of medications for the rest of her life. She lived until 1927, another 35 years after she last took laudanum. She saw her children grow and have families of their own. She saw the world change. She saw medical knowledge advance. She saw understanding of dependence and addiction gradually improve. She saw regulations that had made medications like the ones she had been taking less freely available. Saw the beginning of a recognition that something had gone very wrong in the Victorian era and that change was necessary. And she lived with the knowledge of what she had survived. She lived with the understanding that she had been trapped, that she had been dependent, that she had nearly lost herself completely to substances that had been prescribed by respectable doctors with the best of intentions. She lived with the knowledge that recovery was possible even after years of feeling as if it was not. Pause. Margaret was not alone. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Victorian drug crisis. It was not an individual problem. It was a social phenomenon. Thousands of women, tens of thousands perhaps, found themselves in situations similar to Margaret's. The crisis was so widespread that by the end of the 19th century, some estimates suggested that as many as 1 in 4 women in certain social classes might be dependent on medications containing opium or cocaine. 1 in 4. This was an epidemic. Though it was not recognized as such, was not discussed openly, was not acknowledged publicly. What made this a social phenomenon rather than an individual problem was that the medical establishment supported it. Doctors who should have recognized what was happening did not recognize it. Or if they did recognize it, they did not know what to do about it. The medications were too powerful. They worked too well at suppressing symptoms. The system was invested in continuing the medications. The pharmaceutical industry supported it. Companies that were making enormous profits from selling these medications had every incentive to continue selling them. They employed salesmen like Mr. Davies who went door to door, promoting the medications to women who were susceptible to their marketing, who were vulnerable to suggestions that relief would be found in a bottle, who were desperate enough to try anything. Society supported it. Women were expected to manage their emotions. Women were expected to be calm and composed and emotionally stable at all times. The fact that this was often impossible, that the demands of being a woman in Victorian society were inherently anxiety-producing, was not acknowledged. Instead, women were told that if they experienced anxiety, it was a sign of weakness, a sign of constitutional fragility, a sign of disease. And the solution was medication. There was also an element of class that cannot be ignored. The laudanum and cocaine that Margaret was taking were expensive. They were not available to poor women. Or rather, they were available in different forms. Cheaper versions, less pure versions, versions sold by street vendors instead of respectable chemists. But the phenomenon was similar. Poor women, too, became dependent on these substances. The difference was that when they did, they were labeled as addicts, as morally depraved, as people who had chosen to become dependent. Whereas women like Margaret from respectable families were understood as being patients, as being victims of disease, as being people who had unfortunately become dependent despite their best efforts to remain healthy. This was a hypocrisy at the heart of the Victorian drug crisis. The substances themselves were the same. The mechanism of dependence was the same. The effects on the brain and body were the same. But the social response was entirely different depending on the social class of the person who was dependent. By the late 1880s, there were beginning to be voices raised in concern. There were doctors who had begun to notice that certain medications seemed to be creating more problems than they were solving. There were journalists who had begun to investigate the pharmaceutical industry and the claims that it was making. There were reformers who believed that something needed to be done to regulate these substances, to restrict their availability, to protect people from becoming dependent on them. But the response from the medical establishment and the pharmaceutical industry was to deny that there was a problem. They argued that the concerns were overblown. They argued that dependence was a moral failure, not a medical problem. They argued that restrictions on these medications would harm the people who genuinely needed them for legitimate medical purposes. They argued that the solution was not to restrict the medications, but to educate people about proper use, to encourage people to take them only as directed, to trust that if people took them correctly, dependence would not develop. Pause. The sun dips below the horizon. This happens every day, but it is remarkable nonetheless. The light in the room, whatever room you are in, becomes dimmer. Your eyes are heavy now. Your body feels heavier. The story that we have traveled through tonight is fading away, becoming less distinct, moving into the territory of memory and dream. Margaret sits in her sitting room in 1895, 8 years after she began taking laudanum, 3 years after she stopped. The room is lit by lamplight. The curtains are drawn. She is reading. She is able to read now. She can follow a narrative. She can maintain focus. Her mind is her own again, or at least, it has become her own again, is slowly returning to a state where she feels some sense of ownership over it, some sense of control. She has recovered. It has taken years. It has been difficult. It has been painful. But she has recovered. She remembers now what it felt like to feel the medication taking effect. She can barely imagine why she wanted that feeling. She can barely imagine why it felt like relief. She remembers now that it was not relief. It was a covering up. It was an erasure. It was a suppression of the self in favor of a chemical alternative to the self. She thinks about all the women who are still taking these medications. She thinks about how many of them are where she was dependent but not understand that they are dependent, taking medications prescribed by doctors but slowly being destroyed by them, believing that they are being helped while in fact they are being harmed. She thinks about the doctors. She does not blame them, not entirely. She understands that they were doing what they thought was right, working within a framework that they believe was scientific, trying to help people who were suffering. But she also understands that the framework was wrong, that the science was incomplete, that the medications they were prescribing were dangerous in ways that they did not fully understand. She thinks about her own complicity. She thinks about the decisions she made. She thinks about the times when she suspected something was wrong, but chose not to pursue that suspicion. She thinks about the times when she took more medication than was prescribed, when she purchased bottles on her own, when she allowed herself to become more dependent instead of less. But she also thinks about the circumstances within which she made those decisions. She thinks about the social pressure to be well, to be functional, to be calm and composed at all times. She thinks about the lack of alternatives, the lack of real treatment for anxiety and nervousness other than medication, the lack of understanding about what anxiety actually is or how to treat it without drugs. She thinks about recovery. She thinks about what it took to recover, the support of people who believed in her, the willingness to suffer through withdrawal, the courage to face her anxiety without medicating away, the patience to slowly rebuild her life and her sense of self. And she lives with the knowledge that not everyone recovers. She knows women who are still taking laudanum, who are still dependent, who will likely remain dependent for the rest of their lives. She knows women who died before they could recover, whose bodies gave out, whose minds deteriorated too far to be brought back. Pause. As you lie here tonight, as you drift toward sleep, I want you to feel grateful. Feel grateful that you are not Margaret. Feel grateful that you live in a time where we understand more about how these substances work, where we have different frameworks for understanding mental health anxiety, where we have alternatives to medication, where we have knowledge that Margaret and so many women like her did not have. But also feel compassion. Feel compassion for Margaret and for all the women like her. Feel compassion for the doctors who were trying their best within the framework of their understanding. Feel compassion for the human condition that makes us all vulnerable to the promise of easy solutions, that makes us all susceptible to the appeal of relief that can be obtained through a bottle, through a doctor's prescription, through the endorsement of authority. Feel compassion for the human vulnerability that made the Victorian drug crisis possible, that made it inevitable, that makes similar crises possible even in our own time. Because the human desire to escape from pain is fundamental. The human tendency to believe that a solution exists for complex problems is fundamental. The human capacity for self-deception is fundamental. And recovery, when it happens, is remarkable. Recovery is a restoration of self. Recovery is the reclamation of autonomy. Recovery is the reestablishment of connection to reality, to the body, to the emotions that have been suppressed and subdued. Pause. Let your breathing return to its natural rhythm now. Let your body settle more deeply into whatever is supporting it. Let the weight of the story settle into the back part of your mind, not the front. Let the details fade, but let the understanding remain. The story is complete now. The arc has been traced from the beginning of Margaret's dependence to the end of her recovery. The journey has been traveled from the moment of hope, when she first took the laudanum and felt relief, all the way to the moment of recognition, when she understood that she was trapped and needed to get out, and finally to the moment of recovery, when she discovered that she could reclaim herself, that she could live without the medications, that she was capable of surviving and thriving, and building a meaningful life even after years of chemical dependence. As Margaret descends into rest at the end of her day, as she settles into the comfort of her recovered life, of her reclaimed mind, of her restored self, you too can settle into sleep. You too can rest. You too can know that the day is complete, that the work has been done, that it is time now for restoration and recovery. Your body is heavy. Your eyelids are heavier. The sounds of the world are fading away. The story is fading away. The image of Margaret in her sitting room, reading, recovered, alive, present in her own life, is fading away into the background of your consciousness. Pause. And so, like the woman who has recovered from her dependence, who has reclaimed herself, who has survived the unsurvivable, you too can rest now, knowing that stories like this one matter, knowing that history teaches us even as we sleep, knowing that somewhere in the past, people suffered so that we might understand, so that we might avoid their mistakes, so that we might be wiser. Sleep well. Sleep deeply. Sleep the way that Margaret slept on the first night after her last dose, when she finally understood that she was going to survive this, that recovery was possible, that she would be herself again, that the chemicals that had held her captive would no longer have power over her, that she had reclaimed autonomy over her own mind and body. Sleep the way that someone sleeps when the weight has been lifted. Sleep the way that someone sleeps when the burden has been set down. Sleep the way that someone sleeps who knows that they have survived something terrible and emerged from it changed, but intact, damaged but healing, transformed but still fundamentally themselves. Pause.